We can also touch up these hillshades using the tools over here on the left to remove some of this unwanted texture that we have, and also maybe give this an even darker shadow along the ridge to accentuate its linearity. So the first thing I'm going to do is turn off those channels. We won't need those anymore. And I'm actually going to select the slope and elevation layers and drag those down to the trash because we don't need those as separate layers anymore. Those are just stored in these layer masks. We have this whole area selected, and I'm just going to come up to select and deselect that area, or Control D. So I don't have any areas selected right now that will affect how these tools are used. Just like in ArcMap, if there's an area selected, tools will only work in areas that are selected. And that's actually kind of handy, and I'll show you in just a second why. So let's look at some of the unwanted surface texture that we have here. This region right here seems to have come from a DEM that had a lot of processing artifacts in it. So there's a lot of heavy texture on the surface of this hillshade, and there's also some bumpiness that's right here and has sort of a regular pattern to it. And we'd like to get rid of that. So to start with, let's look at this line right here where there's a clear division between a highly textured area here and a much flatter, more realistic area right there. Our biggest concern is the fact that you can see that line so well, and so I just want to blur that, again using the Gaussian blur tool. To do that, I'm going to come over here and get a rectangular selection marquee. I'll click on that rectangular select tool, and then come over and just draw a rectangle around that area where you've got that clear linear division between those two DEM tiles. So I've got that selection, and now what I want to do is soften the edge of that selection, so whatever filter we use within the selection area won't just abruptly stop at the end of the selection, but will sort of peter out gradually. So with that area selected, I'm going to come up to the Select menu and go to Modify and Feather. And what feathering does is create that sort of soft edge effect. So let's feather with a radius of 30 pixels. That seems reasonable in this case. And if we hit OK, you can actually see a preview of what that 30 pixels means with this radius on the corner of that selection marquee. And now, since the hillshade half layer is the one that's contributing mostly to this sort of flat and low-lying area of this combined hillshade, I'm going to select that so that the filter we're about to use will affect this layer. And then I'm going to come up to Filter and Blur and Gaussian Blur. And you can see a preview of what's going on here. It's blurred this area, and that blur is sort of gradually diminishing as it gets to the edge of the selection because we feathered that selection. So we're going to blur it just enough so that we can no longer distinguish that hard line between these two surface textures. That looks to be about enough. I'll hit OK, and then we can do Control D to deselect. And now that hard line is much less distinguishable. We can also use a brush in order to affect the way that we see through one of these layer masks and perhaps bring out the Snake Mountain Ridge by having it drawn in this exaggerated Hillshade 2 layer rather than the Hillshade half layer beneath it. So let's go and select the mask for Hillshade 2. And again, I'm going to go to Window and turn on my channels just so I can see the channels that are influencing that mask. I'm going to turn on the mask visibility. And then I'd like to brighten the area of the mask that includes Snake Mountain so that I can see the exaggerated Hillshade 2 beneath it. So I'm going to come over and get my brush tool, and then I'm going to change my color swatches. The swatch on the top here is what it will be drawing with the brush tool. That's called the foreground color. And so I'm just going to switch the foreground and background so that white is the foreground color. Then you can see the size of the brush tool is previewed by the circle cursor. If I want to change the size, I can right-click, and then I can change the size of the brush. I can also change its hardness, and so 100% hard would mean that it has this very crisp edge, and 0% hard means that it's going to feather out from the center of that brush. And I'll leave it as a soft brush with no hardness. So now I just want to start drawing along the top of that Snake Mountain Ridge, and you can see as soon as I add some brightness to that center part that it's starting to poke through from that exaggerated Hillshade 2 layer, and Snake Mountain becomes more visible with higher contrast between the east and west side of the ridge. So what if I want to add even more darkness to the back side of this ridge than this Hillshade 2 layer is giving me? Well, I can do that by using the dodging and burning tools. So I'm going to come back here and select just the regular Hillshade 2 layer and say that I want to make this back side of Snake Mountain even darker. If I come over to the toolbar, the dodge and burn tools look like a dodge wand and then a hand that's cupped, and these are made to mimic the ways that you would dodge and burn in a dark room, using a wand to prevent light from reaching the photographic emulsion of your photo paper, or your hands to cup light into a concentrated place on that emulsion. The dodge tool is going to brighten areas of your image, and the burn tool is going to darken areas of your image. And a nice thing about Photoshop is that you can use the dodge and burn tools basically as brushes. So right now I have the burn tool selected. I can right click and change the size of the brush that I'm using to apply that burning effect, and then I can just draw right on my image, and you can see that it's getting a little bit darker as I draw the burn tool over it. You can change the exposure value of that tool. So right now I have it set down to 14%, which is very low, but that gives me a lot of control. I need to go over a number of times in order to really make that area darker. And I sort of like working with low exposures because that way my brush has a subtle effect rather than changing a lot at once. I can also do that with this ridge line over here if I wanted it to be a little bit darker, and I might increase the exposure just a little bit, maybe even the size of my brush, and then use it along that ridge line. I'm just holding the mouse as I move it up and down, and you give it just as much as you want in order to accentuate the shadow effect on either side of those ridges. Another tool you might want to use in order to remove some of this unwanted texture on the valley surface is the smudge tool, and that's right over here. It looks like a finger that's being used to smudge the image. If I get the smudge tool, again, I can change the size of the brush by right-clicking and changing that size. And you can change the strength of the smudge tool up here. Again, I'm going to leave it relatively low in strength. And then I just like to sort of blot the smudge tool where there's this unwanted texture. I'm actually going to use it on this hillshade half layer because that's where most of this valley texture is stored. And I'm just going to sort of smudge out that area where we have that unwanted valley texture that's kind of grid-like. And you can see it doesn't take a lot in order to really reduce the amount of texture that you're seeing. So between all of those tools, including the filters that affect all parts of the image at once, or also these image adjustment tools that affect all parts of the image at once, or some of these other tools that allow you with a brush to affect a specific part of the image, you can do a lot of manipulation of the tone and the contrast and the overall smoothness of various parts of your hillshade. And you can use layer masking to merge multiple hillshades together and create these composite hillshade effects.